Hi, this is 180 Degrees, a show about the changes we all need to make for a clean energy future. Brought to you by SEAI. Episode 5, The Future of Ireland.
So it's time to grab your hoverboard and self-lacing trainers as we take a look at what Ireland's energy and climate future may look like. Hello all, and a big welcome to my guests. Liam Delaney, Professor of Economics at UCD, Liz Walsh, Meteorologist from Eireann Forecasting Division, and Ruth Buggie, Programme Manager for SEAI. How are you all doing?
Very good.
Pretty good, thanks Tom.
Great to have you all with us. So Liam, first to you, I'd just like to ask you, you work at this intersection between psychology and economics, and you fuse that together. Why and what does it give us?
I think the main thing is, as the climate changes or as we attempt to mitigate or reverse climate change, there's a huge amount of behaviours that need to change in terms of how people interact with technology and consumption and so on and so forth. So one theory is, of course, you change the incentives, but there's a lot more than that. There's a lot that goes on in how people interpret these things, how they understand climate change, how they understand their own behaviour, the extent to which they find different actions by the government acceptable. So I think really what people are trying to do at the moment is bring all that together. So look at economic incentives like things like carbon taxes, but also look at, well, how do people actually model these things in their mind? How do they understand the relationship between their own behaviour and these vast, complicated global events? And what is the role of things like social norms, information, all of these like complex human interactions, and try to see how, for example, that would, if you take something like the plastic bag tax, it changed behaviour partly because it changed incentives, but also it totally changed the way the government communicated to people about things like plastic. So that's what this broad area is trying to do, is get that intersection between economics and the incentives of economics and human elements of how people respond to these things.
Great. And Liz, you're working with Eireann and you're working on Eireann's podcast. How's that going for you?
That's right. Yeah, we started the podcast. The first one went out in June. So we're just kind of doing a monthly one at the moment. So yeah, we have a few in the can at the moment. So we'll be releasing them slowly.
Right. And no spin-off series planned yet?
Not yet.
And why are we obsessed with the weather? Have you found the answer to that one?
I can't, I don't know, to be honest, but it's not an unusual thing. I think like weather is something that we experience on a day-to-day basis, and it's just, and the Irish weather is so changeable, I guess, so it catches people's imagination. But I worked similarly in New Zealand as a forecaster as well, and I would say that they're pretty much on a par with the weather. They're really obsessed with it as well. Maybe not quite to the same extent as Ireland, but they're pretty obsessed as well. So,
okay. Cool. And Ruth, you work with ourselves at SEAI, and you're in the community area in Smart Grid. Smart Grid's a really easy word to say, but give us 30 seconds on what a smart grid might be or what's in a smart grid.
So we currently already have a smart grid. It's about smartening the grid we already have. So that's bringing communications together with our electricity flow. And it's connecting those that generate electricity with those that use electricity, and try to change behaviour around when we might use electricity to times when it's cheaper or have less carbon intensity involved in it. So giving people information about when they're using electricity and how much they've used through a smart meter can give them information to maybe change when and how they use electricity. And I know, using the weather analogy, when I was growing up at 9:25, if you didn't switch the TV over for the weather, my mother would come roaring in, "What's the weather?" Because that would determine tomorrow's behaviour. And you would get the war cry if it started to rain. And we went out, we had an industrial washing line. It had a pulley system on it, and if there was clothes on that line and it rained, you were dead. So it's just that information and behaviour, where showing her now an app on her phone that can show her where exactly the rain is holds no interest. She's fixated on that 9:25, 9:30 broadcast because that was what she was used to. So it's giving people more information to help them make a behaviour change that is appropriate and reduce their climate impact. So information, that's what SMART is about.
Great. So this podcast is focusing on the future, our climate and energy future. And we thought it'd be a good idea to get the views of some people on the streets of Dublin about what they think Ireland might look like in 50 years. So let's have a listen.
So what do you think Ireland will look like in 50 years?
Sahara Desert.
So it's definitely going to be a hotter country, and also without doubt there will definitely be a rise in the ocean.
Howth will be an island. Portmarnock and Clontarf and all of those will be gone.
They're going to be climate refugees, much more of them, and we have to think about how we're going to welcome them or not. Some people may not want to welcome them.
I don't know. I don't think it's going to be in a great state, to be honest, just with the way the rest of the world is going, like the way that all the other leaders are. I don't think it's a lot of hope.
Like something from outer space, because I'll say we're in that direction.
Could well be, a freakish apocalyptic landscape.
Well, a bit gloomy there. It might start, given that most of that reflected on the weather or the climate that we might have.
Sure did.
So, Liz, are we heading that direction, and is the evidence clear that we're already on that path?
It's certainly clear that we're going to be hotter than, like, by mid-century Ireland will be warmer, and we'll have hotter, drier summers. There's uncertainty about the amount of rainfall. In fact, the total rainfall might be around the same, but we might get it in a different way. We might see more intense rainfall events. And it certainly looks like that the summers will be drier. So the idea is that, what the climate models and trends are saying is that it'll be wet when it's wetter. It'll be wetter when it's wet and drier when it's dry. So that's the overall trend of things.
Yeah. And Liam, if the people in the streets of Dublin feel that way and that's enough to put the fear of God into anyone, what they're talking about. So why do we have this image of what might be coming, but we don't think we're doing anything about it? What's going on in our brains that splits that out?
Well, the route to... Well, firstly, the various types of behaviours that we have to adopt, as a globe and nationally are very widespread. And are, each of these behaviours, whether it's adopting different types of transport modes or, home heating systems, all of these types of things are fed into by a vast array of factors. You may believe something is going to happen, you may know what to do, or you may not know what to do, but actually changing your behaviour is a much more complicated thing. There's a great paper on the dragons of inaction, which is all of these factors that would lead you to kind of feel you should do something, but not quite know what to do. And if you listen to the people in the Vox Pop, they're clearly taken on board the idea that climate change comes with all these sort of catastrophic risks. But converting that into your own behaviour is complicated for everyone. I mean, what do you then do? So I think when we will talk about this more as the programme goes on. But I mean, fear is one chain in a one part of a chain that leads to behaviour. But I think accessibility, information, what you think is normal in a situation, your capability. So a lot of us actually feel, we think climate change is a really big thing, but what am I actually equipped to do myself as a person? And also, to what extent do I trust the government to enact things that will actually, so take something like carbon tax. So you'll have people who absolutely believe climate change is a problem, but are against a large-scale carbon tax because either they've been fed information from the internet that tells them, it's not going to work, or they don't trust the government and so on and so forth. So I think it's a big complex soup. It's not as simple as saying, the public accepts that climate change is a problem, therefore they accept all the different mitigating and adapting behaviours that have to come with it.
And is it possible that there is a bit of that we sort of need a bogeyman out there, a threat at all times? We were fearful of war, we're fearful of nuclear holocaust, we're fearful of famine, we're fearful of blight and drought and pestilence and all that. Does the human psyche need a little bit of fear in its life, or
I don't know. I mean, people have talked about that. I think there was actually two things happening for a long time. You had climate change being put forward as this catastrophic event, but it wasn't actually connecting into a lot of things that people could actually do something about. I think actually one thing that's healthy recently is you're starting to see things like central bank governors go, look, this is just something we have to plan for. We've got to do something about this. So I mean, I think that's the important thing. It's not that you should be telling people, oh, don't worry about this. It's that you recognise that climate is changing. That's going to create a whole range of things, like the people in the Vox Book are talking about. I mean, it will create refugee scenarios. It will create volatility. It will create political crises. But the question then is, how do you then transmit that to these are a set of actions that Ireland as a country, among many countries, should go with, and that you feel like an empowered citizen to do something about.
And Ruth, you work with a huge array of communities. Do the communities think about climate change, or do they think about saving money, or do they think about health, or what do they think about when they're thinking energy?
Mostly it's about climate change. So it is the prompt that we've seen. And we've seen that evolve over the last 4 years of the programme. So initially it would be attempts to help their neighbours and friends save some money, make better choices. But it has definitely moved into the climate change space. Everything from being a green destination for tourism to attract people in, to genuinely being leaders in their community. And we see different regional variations. About 3/4 of our communities are actually rurally based. And interestingly, in some of the more urban events we've attended, people would ask questions like, how can I get my neighbours to take less flights in a year? Like, well, we can't really tell you how to do that, but, you know, have you looked at how you use your energy at home? And a lot of people go, well, where do I start and how do I make the best impact? And I've used the line before that on joining a gym, I was asked, did I want to be fitter, more toned or lose weight? And I was like, well, I want all three. Communities want to save money, they want to reduce their climate impact, and they want to be good leaders. And sometimes those things don't always give you the same solution. So it's working out what their priorities are. So sometimes saving money helps them make the bigger changes that makes a bigger climate impact. So it's working out for them what their journey needs to be and guiding them on that in the best way possible. And they're developing locally appropriate solutions. One group in Dublin developed a model to try and explain how energy bills work, because they were finding an awful lot of people weren't able to access the lowest priced energy. And like looking this morning, there are 75 different energy plans you could go on, just on a comparison. I mean, we up until 12 years ago, we had one choice. And now you have 75 choices. And if you're not very literate in energy and understanding all the complexities of a bill, it's very difficult. So they developed a programme called Watt Watchers. So every month people would bring their bills in and they'd sit through and they'd see how many kilowatts they'd saved. In the same way you might save kilograms in Weight Watchers. And this was a way of explaining energy to people who didn't need to be hugely energy literate, but it empowered them to make the decisions that helped them save money initially and possibly use those savings to make bigger impacts. So that's the type of process we go through.
Yeah. So just back for a moment, Liz, to the weather and climate. So a friend once commented to me that Ireland has weather, not climate. And, you know, science is generally about 99.x% sure that climate is changing. But I'm going to challenge you in your profession now. Meteorologists tend not to like to point to a single weather event and say that's climate change. So is that not going to confuse people about whether the climate is changing or not if we can't be certain?
Well, I think there is something at the base of this. Like, weather is what we get. Climate is what you expect. So weather is an initial, like, to use like big word, like initial value problem. So the limit of a weather model is roughly about 10 to 14 days. Climate models are looking at, 50 to 100 years in advance, and so it's a different problem. It's a boundary layer problem. So when we say, like, that this storm, the climate models, when you look at them, they don't pinpoint these storms. We're looking at the baseline like parameters, like temperature, amount of rainfall. We're looking at the available energy in the model to create the weather, rather than actually looking at, a weather model that's specifically and explicitly showing, storms forming or, convective showers happening. So it's a different way of looking at things. And I think with regard to climate, it's kind of, and whether saying that something is more likely, we say something is more likely due to climate change because, there's an awful lot of statistics and analysis that has to go on to attribute particular weather events to climate change. But what we can say is that they were made, the recent heat wave in Europe, it was made more likely by climate change. Mm-hmm. That's how you communicate that. It's basically just showing, what the climate models show is that the baseline mean temperature is going up in the background. So, like, for example, like tomorrow, I might say that the top temperature is going to be 23 degrees. Okay, so that's weather. But what I would say from a climate perspective is, like, the temperature that we would expect is a range. And so that range could be anywhere from, like, say, 15 to 25 degrees. So it's just it's a different way of looking at things. So we can't really explicitly say one event is due to climate change, but we can say that a number of events happening and more extreme events happening was made more likely by climate change.
Okay. And when it comes then to climate change and the actions we can take, Liam, so some of the technologies are there today. You know, the electric vehicles are there, insulation for homes, smart heating controls, different products and services for industry and business. But we don't choose them. Like, we don't go out and buy them today. Why, if we're not denying climate change is happening, but we won't help ourselves to some of the solutions.
Yeah, I mean, the process by which these happen are quite interesting. So you see, I mean, it'll take one example of a success story, which was plastic bag reduction, which, as Frank Convery and his colleagues pointed out in their paper, that's an example of probably one of the only examples of a tax for which it would be politically unpopular to remove it. And it had this dramatic effect. It was a change of incentives, but it got people really thinking that, using plastic bags in that way was a bad idea, and it changed the behaviour. And you are seeing, I think David Attenborough probably had a lot to do with it. Something similar happening with single-use plastics in general. That's really become on the agenda. Why that did, as opposed to other, equally or more environmentally damaging aspects of behaviour, why that popped up. I mean, sometimes it's random. Social norms travel around in various different types of ways, and people can be inconsistent. I mean, you're certainly seeing a lot of high-income people who've started now to move to reusable cups, but drive, large emitting jeeps, and not unusual to see somebody coming out of a supermarket loading the linen bags into the back of a four-wheel drive, and that's we are inconsistent like that. And I'd say academics are guilty of it as anyone. It's not unusual to be sitting in an academic conference that 1,000 people have flown all over the world to be at to discuss sustainability. So I think that when you're looking at human behaviour, it's a combination of people vaguely trying to do the right thing, wanting it to be fair on them. They want what they're doing to be reflected in what other people are doing, but teasing through this in all sorts of multiple little modules in their mind, so that they could be, could have people that are perfectly environmentally sustainable in one area, not environmentally sustainable in another, but have got a way of justifying it to themselves. So in terms of how it will roll on, I mean, you are seeing a move towards people recognising sustainability as being a goal that they want to achieve, and then trying to figure it out in different domains. And like we were talking about earlier, it's very complicated in some of those areas. So one thing that will happen is, as these technologies diffuse, people will start talking to each other about them more. It'll make them more normal. And I think there's a good question as to the role of the government, the role of folks like SEAI in those types of processes to sort of jog it along and to make these things more normal. I would say, as an economist, incentives matter, making it cheaper, but they're not the only thing. I mean, really, in some sense, the incentives in this are just one part of a bigger sort of social process.
So, Ruth, Liz says that the climate is changing. Liam says it's very complicated and we're probably incapable of changing, or maybe not as harsh as that. So, are you worried about climate change then?
I'm worried about it, but I believe it's a societal transformation rather than a technical transformation. I think if society leads technology development, we'll win. If technology tries to lead society, we'll lose. And seeing those solutions come about and being involved in a number of projects where at an international level we get a lot of technical people who go, we've all of the solutions, we're going to develop them for 2.5 years, and the last 6 months of the project we're going to deploy them with the community, and the project fails, and they wonder why. It has to happen by people saying, these are the problems we want you to solve, getting a solution for it and then deploying it in a way with the people that want the solution deployed with them. I think from what Liam said earlier around how David Attenborough made a change, for me, I think possibly the part of the problem with climate change was its poster child was a polar bear, and we were never going to see a polar bear in its natural environment, so it not being in its natural environment was never going to affect us. So seeing plastic in an ocean that we want to be part of is something that we can feel part of, but a polar bear, having been that idea that we were going to lose, we lost something we never had for us in Ireland. So I think that's maybe part of the marketing campaign and the conversation for the last 15 years, and it needs to become something much more tangible. I think last year's drought, when we saw the fodder crisis that happened, we could see a very direct impact, and yet I was seeing all of my neighbours cut their grass and dumping it over a wall, and we'd farmers screaming for it, and we don't have a collective solution for using what we have in the right way necessarily. So I think it's that idea of how do we bring it home to something that we can fix, we feel empowered to change our own behaviour around, and that there is solutions there, and the solutions will be developed as well.
It's just like the idea though of the polar bear is like the what's happening in the Arctic is that is part of that link in the chain that's what's happening downstream.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the Arctic is one of those things where it's a key indicator of climate change. And, you know, we talk about a 1.5 degree rise, 2 degree rises, this kind of idea. But like that's over the global mean of the globe. In the Arctic, the temperature change there is, you know, going to be anything from 3 to 9 degrees.
Is an area the size of Belgium currently on fire?
Certainly, yeah.
In somewhere we consider completely white and covered in snow.
You know, and 30 degrees in Alaska, you know, the other month. So, you know, it's those areas that are they're the warning signals, you know, the canary in the coal mine.
Mm-hmm.
And that will translate to more extreme weather. Like, you know, it will translate to sea level rise, and so when we get storms, there's more of an idea that we might have more storm surge events and stuff like that. So it's one of those things that making that connection, and you're totally right. I mean, but it's, you know, there is a connection, you know.
It's the science warning rather possibly than the social warning.
Certainly,
and I think that's
yeah.
the difference for us, is how do we see a social warning that we can feel empowered by and not afraid of. And going back to the linen bags in the back of the Jeep, for many years people would come up at events and say, I've built a passive house, and you're like, that's brilliant, how are you finding it, what's your experience been like? And then you'd say, how big is it? It's about 5,500 square foot. And you're like, gosh, what you could have done if you'd built a small passive house. So it's the intention and the action and what they're hoping to achieve. And yes, a 5,500 square foot passive house is far better than a non-passive house built that way, but it's understanding the balance and the trade-off that people make, and do they know the real impact of the trade-off that they've made, and are they okay with that? And I think not necessarily all the right information is out there for that.
I think it's something that Liam was talking about earlier, was like, I think, you know, with the plastic bags and the big cards, it's just that, you know, when people think about things, it's much easier to concentrate on a little small picture rather than look at the big picture, and you know, to just solve a little small problem rather than a much bigger problem. It makes it more palatable, I guess. So it is kind of trying to educate people in a way that, you know, maybe you could make a huge change and go to an electric vehicle.
Absolutely. And I mean, I very, with almost blinkered eyes, looked at a calculator this morning to see how much emissions would be associated with a flight. A colleague of ours is getting married, and just to see what a flight to and from Italy would involve. And it came in around 400 kilograms of CO2. And I was like, well, house is about 6, so that's not the worst thing in the world. So I was able to trade that off in my own head and go, at least now I know. But I did do it like with kind of going, oh God, how bad is this going to be? Now, I didn't add in the other flights I've made this year. It was one isolated event, but at least I said, okay, I want to own it and see what it actually is. And then, okay, now I know what it is. It's a decision I've made. Relate it back to how far I travel in my car. Can I transfer some of that to an electric car? And they're the choices and the trade-offs that we have to make.
And the talk there is of a societal change and seeing some chinks in, you know, about the way people are behaving. We had the recent elections showing some interest in green matters. Liam, when somebody calls for a societal change, that can be disempowering to individuals as well, because they feel that I might be part of society, but I can't change society. Would you have hope that we can change sufficiently, given the scale of the challenge?
As an economist, I'm not sure I trade in hope. I mean, more. I think. Well, it is. I mean, looking at it with a cold eye in a country like Ireland, it's you can see things, and the political system is sort of fumbling around for things that they can do relatively uncontroversially. And I think something like the interest in single-use plastics partly arises from the fact that, you know, the plastic bag tax was popular. We will eventually, I think, come up with a coffee cup levy that most people will be able to live with, and the political system is sort of looking for things like that it can do. Even I think you know, home insulation is something that's potentially good for everyone, and they like doing these types of things. And in some sense, I don't want to dismiss these, because these can all be very, very much part of it, and it's, you know, individual change and political change. Where it becomes interesting is where real political changes have to be made. And if you take something like the carbon tax, that's a very complicated thing for a politician to want to enact, like to put it up to a level where, you know, take people like John Fitzgerald and so on, that the types of numbers they're talking about, that could yield a really big political backlash from people saying, okay, I accept climate change, but why is this coming down on me? You know, I have to drive into the city to work. Why am I paying for this? And they can mitigate it in different ways. But I think that's where the really interesting stuff will happen in the next 10 to 15 years, is how will we have those, you know, what are, you know, very intense political debates. And as the situation sort of gets more urgent over time, those are the types of things we'll be looking at, is politicians having to stand in front of their electorate and say, we're going to have to do something that you may not like, or a chunk of you won't like, but we're doing it for this reason, and try to bring people on board on it. And so whether you say hope or not, I think that's what I see in my mind. I try to imagine a scenario where somebody like Leo Varadkar stands out in front of the population and says, this is a massive issue that we can't solve by, very small measures. We have to actually put forward a climate change budget, for example, that will have winners and losers over a particular time period, but you believe in the end will be beneficial for everyone.
And just to pick up on one point there, you jest about you don't trade in hope, which is fine, but there is this thing with psychology of balancing fear and hope as you're conveying. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? When you come to something as hugely adversarial as climate change, or potentially, destroying the planet, at what point, or where is that balance between fear and hope?
For me, it's about. People use the word empowerment. I think that's probably a good way of phrasing it. I would look at it as, where are the decision points being made? And some of it is individual, but obviously, you can't choose an electric vehicle unless the infrastructure around you is set up for electric vehicles. You can't engage in environmentally sustainable forms of recycling if that infrastructure isn't set. So it's partly got to do with individual choices and changing individual behaviours. Home insulation is probably a good example. There's many of us who could do more on that, and that will change, I think, over time. But I think hope is basically, in my view, is when you translate this belief for the need for action into people going, well, actually, I can vote for it. I can change my own behaviour. And it's also not just individual decision making. It's that, as consumers, that businesses are responding to this, because we've spoken a lot about individual decision making, but what about large organisations? Like, to what extent are they part of this in terms of their sort of behavioural change? So let me say hope as being translating this sort of sense that everything's going to get worse to a sense that will actually, I can see across a whole range of levels, individual behaviour, state action, industrial behaviour, that things are happening and that they're being monitored in a way that's accountable. But I still think conflict is going to mark this, in the sense that people will disagree on precisely what needs to happen. People might feel that they're being asked to make sacrifices that other folks are not being made. And I don't think, I think how that's handled requires a lot of political skill. If you want to bring it back down to psychology, a lot of it will become on the perception of fairness. So to what extent, if you are, and let's face it is going to be things like large carbon taxes. How do you politically get that across in a way that people feel, actually, I'm bought into this. This is good, as opposed to having riots basically from people just disagreeing with the fairness of it.
There was a reference at the top of the podcast to Back to the Future, and when Marty McFly was sent 30 years into the future in Back to the Future 2, he arrived at a time when there were hoverboards zipping around, people wore self-lacing shoes, and flying cars were the norm. The date was October 21st, 2015, and we all remember Back to the Future Day. So now we do actually have electric scooters and Segways, and we actually have self-driving cars. We don't have flying cars, but we have self-driving cars. So perhaps there is some hope that, change does happen and we experience change. So if I could come back to you, Ruth, and just to imagine for us, what might the house of the future, or that's connected to this smart grid, or how might we be leading our lives if people are ready to change?
There are an awful lot of technologies that already exist today that will be much more widespread at that time. I think, just to put it in context, a house built to an A-rated standard today might only need 5% of the energy of a house built before 1980. So if we're going to look the same way forward, we've already solved 95% of the house energy use. So, what we're talking about now is behaviour after that. So things like having a decision between lowest cost and highest comfort might be what your dial on your heating might look like. It may not be 21 degrees or 19 degrees or 17 degrees if Tom had his way. So it's just understanding what those different choices might look like and what prompts the action that we take. So it could be lowest environmental impact. There's actually a socket that's been developed that can actually connect to the internet and find the lowest cost electricity at that moment in time. So it can already choose the lowest. If your system was enabled for that, you'd be able to continually change your electricity supplier every half hour. And that's the type of things that people can do. But it's about people deciding how much behaviour they're willing to give away, or how much ownership they're going to be able to give away, and how much they're willing to share. So across mainland Europe, people are used to being in district heating schemes. They're used to being part of that system. In Ireland, we're much more used to having our own autonomy. We like detached homes. We have a much higher rate of detached homes. We have a much higher rate of single individual heating systems. We like that independence of that. So where are we going to change? What compromises will we make? Where will we see collective action as being the solution? And Ireland has already done that between co-ops, particularly around farming. In terms of group water schemes, we've solved an awful lot of our own problems ourselves because we felt empowered to do it, because the alternative was no one else was going to do it for us. So where will that take us into the future? So I think in terms of our house styles, where we build them, I know it's a very contentious decision, but we have to just be very careful about where we allow houses go in the future. Will they be able to be supplied with health services in the future, with transport solutions in the future? All of those things, those considerations. So I think it's working out what type of society we want the future to be and working towards that. And I think the decisions that people make between now and 2050, they're going to be different, but they're going to be in an order that suits them best. So it's not appropriate for everyone to go out tomorrow and buy an electric vehicle. One, they're not available, and two, we can't all afford it. So deciding, well, what can I change today that means I can buy an electric car the next time I buy a car, and I get ready for that decision, because they are long-term decisions. If you buy a new heating system today, you're going to expect it to last for 20 years. You've locked out any other financial investment in your heating system for 20 years based on that decision. Did you know that when you bought that boiler? So it's those kinds of things, people being equipped and being ready for the next technology change. They know it's long term. There's
an article, Liam, in the Daily Mirror today, and it talks about the eco-tech home of the future, and it has all sorts of funky stuff like intelligent temperature controls, electric carpooling, hydroponically grown fruit and veg, indoor grown in sand and liquid, smaller batteries, bigger batteries, better batteries. Is there some chance that actually all of this, first of all, do you think this sort of tech, in your opinion, this sort of tech is actually likely to happen? And could it be that tech will provide a solution without us actually consciously taking it on board for climate change purposes, if you get my drift?
My worry in general has tended to be we overemphasise the tech solutions. I mean, there's obviously many people have made this point. There's a great concept of the last mile where you can develop all these tech solutions, but their actual social and cultural adoption is a very different thing. And, you know, even in a lot of our science funding at the moment, it tends to go towards people trying to develop technological solutions to these sort of issues. And you often end up after years and years and years of development with a technology that a very small subset of the population will adopt, a subset that's already doing pretty much the right things on other areas. So, I mean, technology is clearly going to be a huge part of it. There's no question about that. But we need a lot more discussion about cultural, social, psychological fit, ethnography of these types of technologies. Again, lots of people working on it, but I think government get a lot more excited about technological development compared to just the brass tacks of individuals sort of engaging with it. So when I see some of these technologies, you would see them as one part of a very big chain involving everything that we were talking about here, like planning, taxes, social norms, all of these types of things. I mean, the other thing I would say about these technologies, we're not spending enough time thinking about how they'll be regulated. The amount of data we hand over regularly on the basis of these technologies, the implications it'll have for how these technologies are priced. I mean, in a good scenario, it will allow remote control of climate systems and so on to make houses a lot more efficient, to help people overcome all the complexity of being energy efficient. In bad scenarios, it really allows exploitation of all sorts of cognitive biases. And at the moment, our regulators really are nowhere near as advanced in their thinking on this as the companies that are starting to develop them. So, I mean, it's far from apparent that the development of all this technology will translate into a sort of fair, ethical improvement in sort of household and business energy use. And there's all sorts. I mean, I have said before, we need to develop better capacities for imagining regulatory problems with some of these technologies. Not that I am against any of these technologies, but they will work to the extent that they are embedded fairly and broadly across society, rather than just being used as mechanisms of improving sort of ability to price electricity at people and energy at people.
And Ruth, the talk in a lot of it is, as I say, about bigger batteries, better batteries, smarter batteries. Why are batteries going to be so important in the grid of the future?
So with the, I suppose, the installation of smart meters in all homes by 2024, there is an expectation that along with that will grow microgeneration opportunities. So people will be able to put solar panels on their roof and they'll be able to sell electricity into the grid. The challenge with that is that if they're selling it into the grid at the market price, they're probably only going to get 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour for that, and they're paying about 18 cents for the power that they buy. So they're losing a significant amount of that investment. But if they could store that electricity until such time as they wanted to use it, then they could avoid that 18 cent cost. So it's being able to be empowered a bit more, and it's literally empowerment that you can store your electricity for when you use it. But we also have the opportunity that the battery in your electric car could also serve as a backup to the grid. And one 60 kilowatt battery in a car is not going to fix the grid, but 1 million electric vehicles on the grid would create a huge amount of storage. So we've solved the short-term storage challenge on the grid, solutions that were put in many, many years ago, including Turlock Hill, that idea that we can pump water to the top of a mountain and then when we need electricity we just let it flow out, and it's a water battery in effect. We also have the opportunity to use our houses as thermal batteries. So you could have a situation where your heat pump is actually controlled by the grid operator. When they've got more wind on the system than they need, you allow them to turn your heating system on for you, and that way your house stores heat until you need it, because with a heat pump you might only need it to run for a couple of hours a day, and it doesn't really matter if your house is built correctly when those hours are. So you're allowing more wind onto the grid because there's more flexibility, because they can dispatch it when they don't need, when you have a demand for it, and you're getting electricity at the lowest possible cost and the lowest climate cost as well.
So we're almost out of time, so I just want to go with one slightly quick-fire question, which is hope or hopelessness. So when I ask each of the panellists to decide, do you have hope that we will have changed or put the brakes on properly by 2050? Liam?
I think it's clear a lot of very vulnerable people throughout the world are going to die or going to have their life chances substantially reduced by climate change. So from a global perspective, we've had a lot of ethical failings in not dealing with this. So I don't want to say hope, because I think it depends on who you are and where you're living. I think for a lot of people this is going to be really bad. In the Irish case, I think we will fumble the way we always do towards something better, but it'll involve both technological development, it'll involve some things happening at a quick pace that we'll look at and go, this is very good, and it'll involve political choices that we will prevaricate on for most of the next 20 or 30 years around things like carbon tax, around things like agricultural emissions, around things like business regulation, that broadly I think as the younger generations come through, there'll be more political momentum to do something on this and we will see changes. But we won't wake up one morning, I really don't believe we'll wake up one morning and the political system will suddenly have converted into something wonderful. I think this will be a series of very difficult trade-offs. But if you want me to say nationally, we are seeing a capacity to imagine the right thing to do in a way in the country that we haven't seen before. So if you want me to leave on a positive note, I guess that's a source of hope. But this is far from something that you could be unambiguously positive about.
No, I think that's a very frank perspective, Liam, and thanks for that. Ruth?
Taking the national context for programmes and the people that I've worked with, I do think that they're ready to embrace the solutions and they actually want to develop solutions themselves and they want to be leaders in their own communities, and seeing that happen from a volunteer effort led type of programme is hugely hopeful. I do think there are some that believe we will use one technology to blanket the country out of climate change. It's going to be one solution, it's going to solve all of our problems, and we haven't got it yet, or whatever it is going to work. And I think understanding that it's going to be a basket of solutions and a basket of changes, and some of those solutions aren't in the basket yet, but it's going to involve a lot of those different things in combination, and the right combination. And I think Liam's comment about where we get leadership from and who makes those decisions and do they make the right ones at the right time is critical to that success. But I would like to be very hopeful.
And Liz?
I'm similar to Ruth. I'd like to be very hopeful. I think nature will show us. And I think, the world is going to be fine. It's just how the animals and the biodiversity and humans will be in that new world, and how they will interact with that is going to have to change. And it is going to take some very tough decisions, as Liam was saying. But I'm just an optimistic person. I think we can do this, and we have to do this. So it's hope, I guess.
Okay, well, it's been a really invigorating conversation and an awful lot of food for thought. So my thanks to our wonderful guests, Liz Walsh from Eireann, Liam Delaney from UCD, and my own colleague Ruth. Thank you.
"180 Degrees is brought to you by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Join us next time when we'll be chatting about how you, as an individual, can make a difference in tackling climate change. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and there's more at seai.ie/podcast. You can also follow us on Twitter and use the hashtag SEAI Podcast.